This week I've started my big push for finishing the excavation of the indoor floors. And with the hot weather, the awkward spaces and a bit of a sore elbow, it's been a bit of a test, especially after coming back from a very relaxing long weekend away. This is what I've been up to. Cheers. I know, I'm sure you must be thinking, how can a week of digging be quite so exciting? Well, with some good editing and some good explanations, I'm hoping that I'll be able to help you get through it. About a month ago, I started work on lowering the floor in 2 of the final rooms at the front, but in the last 3 weeks, I've not been able to do much in there. So this week, I'm making a big push to try and finish as much as possible. At the start of the week, I had a few things to catch up on the first morning after we got back a bit later than planned from our long weekend away. But after that, I picked up the jackhammer from the local rental store and got straight into the work. For all of this work, I'm going to be moving the rocks by wheelbarrow to the dumping pile outside. And to keep this as simple as possible, I'm going to be starting the work in the far room before I take out any of the rock in the middle room, which is on the wheelbarrow path. First up, I had to clear some of the smaller rocks still on the floor from work over the last month. As a quick reminder, the overall target for all of the excavation work is to remove 90 centimeters of rock, 45 centimeters to enable modern flooring to be put in, and 45 centimeters to make the ceiling height more comfortable under the vaults. At this end of the room, I have another 40 to 50 centimeters to remove, and slightly less at the other end where I've done a bit more work recently. I started at this end because I thought it would be slightly easier to move around in. In these clips, I'm only showing you the hammer work, which is actually the easiest part of the process, even though a 15-kilo hammer does start to get a bit heavy after a while. The harder work is getting the rocks into the wheelbarrow, and I found that getting the rocks onto the flat wooden boards makes this way easier. So clearing a space big enough for a wooden board is always an important first step. The perfect scenario is for as much rock as possible to fall straight onto the wooden boards so that you reduce a whole lot of raking work. Most of the rock seams at this end tend to break up quite easily, but some parts come out bigger and need some extra work. After filling the wheelbarrow, I decided this would be my last load for the day. On the second day, I started working from the other end, where the rocks tend to come out bigger. To break up some of these bigger pieces, it's much easier to use the pickaxe. And although they are heavier, the bigger pieces are actually quicker to take out. The pickaxe is also easier to use for the more precise work around the corners and on smaller surface seams. And sometimes it makes it easier to move the rocks around and take out. But unfortunately, it doesn't make the wheelbarrow lighter or the ramp less steep. For some seams near the wall, I had to use the crowbar to lever out rocks with a bit more control, which does require a bit more energy and can bring forward a first cold coffee break. Nearly all of the rock seams below the house are at an angle parallel to the slope of the hill, and because of this angle, I'm excavating the rock on the right-hand side slightly differently, trying to avoid taking out too much rock under the walls at this stage. This means creating a sloping ledge, which is a bit more than 50 centimeters from the wall edge. Having cleared a good space for the bigger wooden board, I was now able to start working my way back towards the door through the middle of the room. The rocks in these seams were also pretty big, and I needed to start using the pickaxe for certain parts, and I needed to start using the hammer at more of an angle for other parts to be able to break the rocks along the seam lines. Using the hammer at an angle was a bit awkward, but it does help to avoid the hard work of lifting it out vertically when it goes deep into some rock. Quite a lot of the rocks were coming out a bit bigger, so I needed to combine some manual pickups with some of the shovel work. And some fast feet around the ledge on the right. And as I was about halfway across the room, I did one final wheelbarrow load before a lunch break. At the start of the day, I was wearing the sleeveless jacket, but I was sweating so much it started to become really uncomfortable. So my lunch break was as much a cooling down break. And although the sun was very hot outside, there was a very nice breeze, so I finished lunch with a quick stroll onto the shed roof for some wind cooling. There are still a few butterflies around in the garden, although fewer than in previous weeks, so I had to make do with enjoying the view. Before heading back to work. Which started with some more scraping and then some acrobatic hammering. In the afternoon, I was making pretty good progress across the room, but I was starting to run out of room for the wheelbarrow, so I was now having to lift the rocks up quite a lot more, and it didn't take long before I was pouring with sweat again. Which meant another drinks break was required. Before heading back to work and making a change in the camera position. I normally try to change the camera angle position more often, but the surfaces in these rooms make that quite difficult, both to find a steady surface for the camera and for me to be able to move around the camera and tripod. The uneven surface and the ledge on the left-hand side were also making it quite difficult to move around with the hammer, and at times it was difficult to actually stay on my feet. At the start of the day, I had a slightly sore shin that felt like shin splints, So my mobility had felt a bit worse than usual, but thankfully it was feeling a bit better when I was having to move around a lot in this section. In case you were wondering about the shin splint, I don't think it has anything to do with the work I'm doing. I think it might have been from all the walking that I had done over the previous weekend. On the subject of fitness, my left elbow is still a bit sore, but wearing the elbow supports has really helped. Although some rest from excavating is definitely the best option for helping it get back to 100%. And with the idea of finishing the excavation work as soon as possible in my mind, I picked up the pace and worked hard to try and finish this room that day. But in the end, I didn't quite manage to finish the room before I had to go. My big excitement for the start of the next day was a new pair of gloves, after my old ones had got a bit too worn out to carry on with. So with my brand new bright white gloves, I finished clearing the far room. And then I moved on to working in the middle room, starting with a quick confirmation that I needed to take out about 40 centimeters across most of the room, while leaving about 50 centimeters around the edges under the walls. My plan for this room was to clear a hole in the middle of the room so that I could start to use the wooden boards. The rocks in the middle were breaking up relatively easy, but to start with, progress was quite slow. But once I had the boards down, I started to make faster progress between my refreshment breaks. To track the progress on camera, I mostly filmed each phase of hammerwork, but there was plenty of shoveling in between. Although this work is quite slow and quite hard, once I get into a good rhythm and I'm able to use the wooden boards, it can become quite pleasurable. And it doesn't take too long a break to get the energy levels back up to go again. While I was editing this longer section of hammering and then shoveling, I was thinking that it would have been a good time for an appearance from Billy, especially as he is currently looking pretty smart after a short haircut for summer. But with the hot weather, he didn't come to the house at all this week and stayed at home. When I had cleared almost to the doorway, I checked the depths and realised I probably needed to take out a bit more. So I went back over the area with the hammer and took out another layer of rocks. And when I got back to the middle, I thought it was a good place to stop for the day. The next day, I was quickly back into the rhythm. First, using the hammer, then moving the slightly larger rocks with a pickaxe, getting them into the wheelbarrow, and then out onto the pile. Before starting the process all over again by switching on the generator and jumping back into the room for another hammer. For this phase of the work, I was trying to get to the back wall as quickly as possible, while being a bit more careful with the rock in front of the doorways to the left and the base of the stairs. At lunchtime, I had a meeting scheduled with the builder about the next phase of work. So I did a little bit of tidying up before driving down to the meeting, which was at the first village down the hill in the view from the house. After the meeting, I was back for a final push towards the back wall. As for the meeting, I'm hoping the same building team that worked here before will be back on site in a couple of weeks, when one of the first jobs will be the work reinforcing the bases of the walls and then adding the foundations. And with this next phase of work in mind and for extra motivation, I pushed really hard to try and finish all of this room on the day. Before a final bit of tidying up. It's a long day and I've been looking forward to this for at least a couple of hours. Cheers. I was so refreshed after yesterday evening's non-alcoholic beer that I had been considering one more morning of work before returning the jackhammer. But this morning I decided it was better to stick to my original plan of taking it back today and picking it up again next week, when I'll probably need it for a couple more days, as I've not quite finished the work in the 2 rooms this week, even though I pushed pretty much as hard as I possibly can and added an awful lot more material to my pile out here. I've also got to do a bit more tidying up in a couple of other rooms, and then I've got to do some work in the open plan area through there. But the end of the excavation work is definitely now in sight, which is a big relief for me, and I'm sure for you as well. And hopefully by the end of next week, I'll be able to celebrate finishing it. So I hope to see you then.